A little black girl says just one word at her adoption hearing, and the judge locks down the entire courtroom immediately. Everyone thought it would be a routine case, just another well-off couple adopting a child. But when that one word leaves her lips, everything changes. The truth she's been hiding is darker than anyone imagined, and it points to a secret no one in that courtroom was prepared to face. Why did the judge react so fast? What was the word she said? And what will happen when her full story finally comes to light? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun filtered through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. The old building hummed with activity as people hurried through its halls, their footsteps echoing against the marble surfaces. In a quiet corner of the waiting room, 6-year-old Amara sat perfectly still, her small hands folded in her lap. The pale yellow dress she wore was new and stiff, making her feel like a doll on display. Grace Kessler had picked out the dress specially for today, saying it would make Amara look proper for the judge. The fabric scratched against Amara's skin, but she knew better than to fidget. She'd learned that lesson during her 3 months with the Kesslers. Across the room, Elliot and Grace spoke in hushed tones with their attorney, a man in an expensive suit who kept nodding and smiling. Grace's pearl necklace caught the light as she gestured, her voice carrying that familiar sweet tone she used when others were watching. "We're just so blessed to have found her," Grace was saying, her southern accent thick as honey. "The Lord truly guided us to this precious child." Elliot stood beside his wife, one hand resting possessively on her shoulder. His face wore the same stern expression it always did at home, though now it was masked with a thin smile. "We know she'll flourish under proper guidance," he added, emphasizing the word proper in a way that made Amara's stomach tighten. Meanwhile, in his chambers, Judge Daniel Reynolds sat at his desk, methodically reviewing the Kessler adoption file. His reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he flipped through the pages, noting the glowing recommendations and the unusual speed with which the case had progressed. "The Kesslers are pillars of the community," his clerk had mentioned earlier. "They've done wonderful work with their church's youth ministry." Reynolds nodded to himself, appreciating the orderliness of the paperwork. Everything was in its place, every box checked, every signature perfectly aligned. This was how things should be: neat, organized, following proper procedure. The courtroom filled quickly as the hour approached. Local reporters settled into the back row, their notebooks ready. Members of the Kesslers' church congregation filed in, dressed in their Sunday best, despite it being Thursday. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of so many observers, all eager to witness what they saw as a heartwarming moment of Christian charity. When the court officer called the room to order, his voice carried a note of warmth unusual for such proceedings. "Your Honor, we're here today for the adoption of Amara by Elliot and Grace Kessler," he announced, adding, "The Kesslers have been foster parents for several years and are well-respected members of our community." Amara was led to the front of the courtroom by a court assistant. Her patent leather shoes clicked softly against the floor as she walked, each step carefully measured. The Kesslers sat at a table near the judge's bench, both of them beaming with what looked like pride to the observers. Grace reached out to pat the seat between them, gesturing for Amara to sit. The social worker, a tired-looking woman with a stack of files, stood to give her brief statement. "Amara has adjusted well to the Kessler home," she reported, barely glancing at her notes. "She's shown marked improvement in following instructions and maintaining appropriate behavior." Judge Reynolds began the formal proceedings, his voice carrying the weight of authority through the hushed courtroom. As he spoke, Amara's eyes drifted upward to the large ceiling fan rotating slowly overhead. The steady movement was hypnotic, helping her feel slightly removed from what was happening below. The fan's blades cast shifting shadows that reminded her of the drawings hidden under her mattress back at the Kesslers' house. Drawings of her mother, of her grandmother, of the life she'd had before. Grace had found one once and torn it up, saying, "We don't dwell on the past in this house, dear." Reynolds continued with the formal adoption script, his tone measured and official. The words washed over the courtroom like a familiar tide, each phrase carrying the ceremony toward its expected conclusion. When he finally turned his attention to Amara, the room grew even quieter. "Amara," he said, using what he thought was a gentle voice, "do you agree to be adopted by Mr. and Mrs. Kessler as your forever family?" The silence that followed his question felt heavy. Amara could feel Grace's hand on her back, pressing ever so slightly, a warning touch she'd come to know well. She could sense Elliot's tension beside her, could almost hear his jaw clenching the way it did before he got angry. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely more than a whisper. "Stop." The single word seemed to hover in the air. A murmur rippled through the gallery, growing louder as people shifted in their seats and whispered to their neighbors. Grace's hand stiffened against Amara's back, her fingers digging in just enough to hurt. Judge Reynolds' frown deepened as he watched the disruption spread through his courtroom. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. This wasn't proper procedure. He rapped his gavel once, the sharp sound cutting through the growing noise. "Order," he commanded, and then, "Seal the doors." Court officers moved quickly to close the heavy wooden doors, their mechanisms clicking loudly in the tense atmosphere. The sound seemed to echo through the now silent room, marking a moment when everything had suddenly, unexpectedly changed. The heavy courthouse doors clicked shut with finality, sealing everyone inside the suddenly tense courtroom. The gallery's whispers faded to silence as two security officers took position near the entrance. Judge Reynolds removed his reading glasses, setting them carefully on the bench before leaning forward to address Amara. "Amara," he said, softening his authoritative tone to something gentler, "can you tell me what you meant just now?" The little girl sat rigid in her chair, her yellow dress now wrinkled from Grace's tight grip on her shoulder. Her eyes remained fixed on the ceiling fan, finding comfort in its steady motion. "Please." Amara's voice came out clearer this time, though still quiet. "Stop." Grace's perfectly maintained smile tightened at the corners, transforming into something brittle and forced. Her manicured fingers pressed harder into Amara's shoulder, making the girl flinch almost imperceptibly. Elliot shifted in his chair, his hand dropping casually below the table to squeeze Amara's knee. To anyone watching, it might have looked like a gesture of comfort, but Amara's small body tensed at his touch. "Your Honor," Grace spoke up, her voice dripping with concerned sweetness. "She's just nervous. Children often get overwhelmed in formal settings like this." Judge Reynolds held up his hand, silencing her. Something about Amara's stillness bothered him, though he couldn't quite place why. "I think we should take a brief recess," he announced, rising from the bench. "I'd like to confer with my staff about how best to proceed." The gallery erupted in hushed conversations as Reynolds disappeared through the door behind his bench. Court officers began directing people to stay in their seats while maintaining order. In the hallway outside, Dara King stood near the water fountain, pretending to sort through case files while watching the proceedings through the door's narrow window. As a court intern, she'd seen dozens of adoptions, but something about this one felt off. Through the glass, she could see Grace Kessler's jaw working back and forth, a telltale sign of suppressed anger that contradicted her perfect posture and pleasant smile. Elliot sat beside her, unnaturally still, his eyes fixed straight ahead with cold detachment. They looked less like excited new parents and more like people whose carefully laid plans had hit an unexpected snag. Dara's attention shifted to Amara, who hadn't moved from her chair. The child's small hands were folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. It was the kind of stillness Dara recognized from her own childhood, not the quiet of peace, but the frozen alertness of prey. When Judge Reynolds returned 15 minutes later, Amara had retreated further into silence. She didn't respond to his gentle questioning or react when the court-appointed guardian ad litem tried to speak with her. She simply sat, watching the ceiling fan, her body language screaming what her voice wouldn't. Reynolds cleared his throat, addressing the packed courtroom. Given the sensitive nature of these proceedings and respect for the child's current state, I'm ordering the gallery cleared. We'll continue in closed court. The spectators filed out slowly, many from the Kessler's church shooting disapproving looks at Amara as they left. Once the gallery was empty, Reynolds tried once more to engage with the little girl, but she remained silent. "Perhaps," the judge suggested, A short break would help. 15 minutes to let everyone collect themselves. A female court officer stepped forward to escort Amara from the courtroom. The girl rose mechanically, her movements careful and measured, like someone trying not to provoke a sleeping predator. As Amara disappeared through the side door, the Kesslers huddled together at their table, whispering intensely. Grace's perfectly coiffed head bent close to Elliot's, her lips barely moving as she spoke. Elliot's response was equally quiet, but his clenched fist on the table betrayed his calm exterior. Dara watched them through the window for a moment longer before turning away. Something wasn't right, and years of helping her activist grandparents had taught her to trust that instinct. She walked quickly to Judge Reynolds's chambers, where she had legitimate access as his intern. The case file was still open on his desk. Dara sat in the judge's chair, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she accessed the digital records. The Kesslers' history as foster parents appeared impressive at first glance. Multiple placements, glowing recommendations, strong community standing. But as she dug deeper, she noticed discrepancies. 3 children, all adopted within the past 5 years, all with similar profiles to Amara, young, black, and from troubled backgrounds. What caught her attention wasn't what was there, but what wasn't. The exit reports for these children were oddly bare, lacking the usual detailed documentation of their adjustment and progress. Dara's heart beat faster as she clicked through the files. The pattern was subtle but clear. Each child had essentially disappeared from the system after their adoption, with only minimal follow-up noted. No school records, no medical updates, nothing to indicate what had actually happened to them after entering the Kessler home. Working quickly, Dara sent the relevant files to the printer down the hall. The machine hummed to life, spitting out page after page of documentation. She gathered the warm papers, her hands shaking slightly as she organized them into a coherent sequence. The timestamp on her computer showed that only 10 minutes had passed. In 5 more minutes, everyone would return to the courtroom, and the proceedings would continue as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something was happening. And Dara couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding pieces of a much darker puzzle in her hands. The courthouse cafeteria buzzed with lunchtime chatter, but Dara barely noticed. She sat alone at a corner table, her sandwich untouched beside her laptop, the wheat bread growing stale in the artificial air conditioning. Scattered crumbs dotted the worn Formica tabletop as her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, digging deeper into the foster care agency's database. She used her intern credentials to access their internal system, the familiar login screen a gateway to what she suspected were carefully hidden secrets. Something about the Kesslers' perfect record didn't sit right with her. The missing exit reports from their previous adoptions had set off alarm bells that kept ringing in her mind, growing louder with each passing hour. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more buried in these digital files, waiting to be uncovered by someone willing to look hard enough. Dara took a sip of water from her reusable bottle, condensation dripping onto her stack of sticky notes. Her eyes scanned through endless rows of case numbers and dates, each one representing a child's life reduced to bureaucratic shorthand. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like restless wasps as she clicked through folder after folder, following her instincts. The words of her grandmother echoed in her mind. "Baby girl, truth leaves traces no matter how well someone tries to hide it. You just got to know where to look and have the courage to see." A notification popped up. Her session would time out in 5 minutes. Dara quickly renewed her login, her fingers flying across the keys, not wanting to lose her place in this digital maze. That's when she saw it. A deleted incident report from 3 months ago during Amara's first month with the Kesslers. The file showed up as a broken link in the main database, its presence like a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect smile, but its metadata was still there, pointing to a backup server like a silent witness. Dara's heart began to race, the steady thump echoing in her ears. She opened a new window and navigated to the backup folder structure, her movements precise despite her growing anticipation. Years of helping her grandparents organize civil rights documentation had taught her how to follow paper trails, both physical and digital. She'd spent countless weekends in their study, learning to piece together the truth from fragments of evidence. The folders were poorly organized, a jumble of misnamed files and unclear categories. but after several minutes of methodical searching, she found what she was looking for: a buried subfolder containing archived reports, hidden away like shameful secrets. The timestamp matched. Dara double-clicked the file, her hands steady despite her racing pulse. A video player window opened on her screen, the loading circle spinning like a tiny carousel of truth. The image was slightly grainy, obviously recorded on a phone, but the audio was clear as crystal. Amara's face filled the frame, her cheeks wet with tears that caught the harsh fluorescent light. She looked even smaller than she did now, her shoulders hunched inward as if trying to disappear, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperate need to be believed. The camera angle showed a slice of institutional green wall behind her, probably a school nurse's office or counselor's room. "They wash me till I'm white," Amara's voice came through Dara's headphones, quiet but distinct, each word carrying the weight of truth. "They say my black is dirty." Dara's hands began to shake as she watched Amara hold up her arms to the camera. Angry red patches covered her skin, irritated and raw like she'd been scrubbed with sandpaper. The little girl then reached off-screen and brought back a bar of soap, holding it up with trembling fingers. Even through the grainy video, Dara could make out the harsh chemical warning label on its side: industrial bleach soap, the kind used for heavy-duty cleaning, not for human skin, the kind that could strip paint off walls. The video ended abruptly at 30 seconds, cutting off mid-frame like someone had yanked the phone away. Dara sat frozen, her lunch completely forgotten, her throat tight with anger and grief. She quickly opened the accompanying report, scanning through the official documentation. The caseworker had filed it as a serious concern, requesting immediate investigation. But a supervisor's note was attached at the bottom, dated just 2 days later. Allegations unsubstantiated. Case closed. The dismissal was signed with a flourishing signature, as if someone was proud of their decision to look away. That was it. No follow-up, no investigation notes, no interviews documented. Just a dismissal, as if Amara's tears and raw skin meant nothing. As if her pain was less real than the convenience of maintaining the status quo. Dara's chair scraped against the floor as she stood up, nearly knocking over her water bottle. She quickly saved the video file to her laptop and gathered her things, her movements urgent but controlled, years of training in professional spaces keeping her from running outright. The cafeteria's noise faded to a distant hum as she focused on what she needed to do next, her mind already several steps ahead. The courthouse hallways were relatively empty during lunch hour, her footsteps echoing off the marble floors as she hurried toward Judge Reynolds' chambers. The sound bounced off the high ceilings, mixing with the distant murmur of voices behind closed doors. She didn't bother knocking. As his intern, she knew he always ate lunch at his desk while reviewing cases, a creature of habit even in moments of crisis. Reynolds looked up from his sandwich as Dara burst through the door, slightly out of breath, her laptop clutched to her chest like a shield. "Your Honor," she managed, trying to keep her voice steady despite the urgency coursing through her veins. "You need to see this now." She opened her laptop on his desk, angling it toward him. Reynolds set down his sandwich and wiped his hands on a paper napkin, his expression shifting from mild annoyance at the interruption to focused attention as Dara pressed play. The video's tinny audio filled his wood-paneled office, Amara's small voice making the space feel suddenly too large and too small all at once. The judge's face remained impassive as he watched, but Dara noticed his fingers tightening on his armrest, the leather creaking under his grip. When Amara's tearful voice said, "They wash me till I'm white," Reynolds' jaw clenched visibly, a muscle jumping beneath his carefully maintained professional mask. The video ended, leaving the office in heavy silence. Reynolds sat completely still, his eyes fixed on the now dark screen, his half-eaten lunch forgotten on his desk. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice low and controlled but with an edge Dara had never heard before. "Call the bailiff," he said, standing up, his chair rolling back against the wall. "Keep the child inside. We reopen the hearing, now." The afternoon sun slanted through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the now sparse gallery. Most of the morning's spectators and reporters had been cleared out, leaving only essential court personnel, the bailiff, and a few legal staff. The emptier space made the room feel larger, more imposing, its high ceilings and dark wood paneling lending gravity to the proceedings. Judge Reynolds sat straight-backed at the bench, his earlier weariness replaced by a controlled intensity. His hands were folded precisely on the desk before him, his reading glasses set aside. The American flag behind him hung still in the quiet air. Amara had been brought back in and seated away from the Kesslers, closer to the bailiff's station. She sat perfectly still, her yellow dress wrinkled from the long day, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor, but there was a subtle change in her posture, as if some of the tension had eased from her shoulders. The Kesslers maintained their composed facade in the front row. Grace's smile remained perfectly in place, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She had touched up her makeup during the break, her lipstick fresh and precise. Elliot sat beside her, one hand resting possessively on her knee, his other hand gripping the edge of the wooden bench. His confidence showed in the slight tilt of his chin, the way he met the judge's gaze directly. "Your Honor," Elliot spoke first, his voice carrying easily in the hushed courtroom. "I feel there's been some misunderstanding here." He squeezed Grace's knee gently, a gesture that looked affectionate but carried an undercurrent of control. "We love Amara. We've provided her with everything she needs, a stable home, moral guidance, proper structure." His tone grew firmer as he continued. "We maintain a clean, orderly household. Our standards may be high, but that's because we want the best for her." Grace nodded in agreement, her earrings catching the light. "We only want to help her reach her full potential," she added softly, her southern accent honey-sweet. Judge Reynolds held up his hand, cutting off any further statements. Without a word, he pressed a button on his desk. A large monitor on the courtroom wall flickered to life. The video began to play. Amara's tear-streaked face filled the screen, her voice small but clear in the silent courtroom. "They wash me till I'm white. They say my black is dirty." The Kesslers went completely still. Grace's perfect smile froze, then cracked at the edges. A flush crept up her neck, spreading across her cheeks. Elliot's hand tightened visibly on her knee, his knuckles whitening. The raw red patches on Amara's skin showed clearly on the large screen. When she held up the bleach soap, the chemical warning label was unmistakable. As the video ended, Grace's composure slipped further. Her breathing had quickened, though she fought to maintain her calm exterior. Elliot leaned closer to her, whispering something too low to hear, his lips barely moving. Grace straightened in her seat, her voice taking on a brittle edge as she responded to the video. "That was taken entirely out of context," she said, each word precise and clipped. "We were simply trying to help her be—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Presentable. Any loving parent would do the same." The temperature in the room seemed to drop at her words. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably at his post. Dara rose from her seat at the intern's table, 3 manila folders clutched in her hands. She approached the bench with measured steps, her heels clicking against the floor in the heavy silence. "Your Honor," she said, placing the folders before Judge Reynolds. "These are the files of 3 previous children adopted by the Kesslers." Reynolds opened the first folder, then the second, his expression growing darker with each page he turned. The third folder seemed to confirm something he'd feared. He looked up, his gaze boring into the Kesslers. "According to these records," he said, his voice deliberately measured, "you've adopted 3 black children over the past 5 years." He spread the papers out before him. None of them are currently enrolled in any local schools. There are no medical records after the first month post-adoption, no exit interviews, no documentation of their whereabouts. He leaned forward slightly, his tone sharpening. "Where are these children?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Every person in the courtroom seemed to hold their breath, waiting. Elliot and Grace sat motionless, their earlier confidence evaporated. Grace's flush had drained away, leaving her face pale. Elliot's jaw worked silently, but no words came out. The hand on his wife's knee had gone completely still. The silence stretched out, becoming almost unbearable. Still, the Kesslers said nothing. In her chair by the bailiff, Amara's small fingers gripped her dress tighter, but her eyes had lifted from the floor. She watched the Kesslers with an expression far too knowing for a 6-year-old, as if she understood exactly what their silence meant. The silence in the courtroom stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Judge Reynolds's question about the whereabouts of the 3 previously adopted children hung heavy in the air. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the wood-paneled walls, making the brass fixtures gleam dully and throwing the worried faces of the court personnel into sharp relief. The tension seemed to grow with each passing second, thick enough to make breathing feel like work. Grace Kessler finally broke the silence, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone used to deflecting uncomfortable questions. "They're being homeschooled," she said, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her cream-colored skirt. Her perfectly manicured nails caught the light as she folded her hands in her lap, the diamond ring on her right hand throwing tiny rainbows against the dark wood of the witness stand. "We're a private family. We prefer to keep our children away from negative influences." The slight pause before her last words carried volumes of unspoken meaning. Elliot nodded, his broad shoulders squared beneath his expensive charcoal suit, the fabric pulling slightly at the buttons from his rigid posture. "They're safe," he added firmly, as if his word alone should be enough to settle the matter. His tone carried an edge of authority, the kind that suggested he wasn't used to being questioned, and his jaw clenched visibly with suppressed anger. Judge Reynolds studied them both, his eyes narrowing slightly behind his wire-rimmed glasses. The lines around his mouth deepened as he turned to the court clerk, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched on her nose and salt and pepper hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Ms. Patterson, I want immediate cross-agency checks run on all 3 children." He picked up the files Dara had provided, the manila folders worn at the edges from frequent handling. Kaylin Williams, age 7, Isaiah Thompson, age 9, and Suri Bennett, age 10. The clerk's fingers flew across her keyboard, the soft clicking sound echoing in the hushed courtroom like raindrops on a tin roof. Minutes ticked by, marked only by the gentle whir of computer fans and the occasional shuffle of papers. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a constant background drone that seemed to heighten the tension. Ms. Patterson looked up from her screen, her expression troubled, lips pressed into a thin line. "Your Honor, I've checked the Department of Education database. There's no homeschooling paperwork filed for any of these children. No applications, no curriculum plans, no quarterly reports, nothing required by state law." Her voice quavered slightly as she delivered the news. Grace's calm facade flickered for just a moment, like a candle in a draft. Her fingers tightened around her purse strap, knuckles whitening, the expensive leather creaking softly under her grip. A muscle twitched in her perfectly made-up cheek. "Check hospital records," Reynolds instructed, his voice growing harder, taking on the edge of granite. "All facilities within a 100-mile radius." He leaned forward in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. More typing filled the silence, the sound growing more urgent. The bailiff shifted his weight, one hand moving closer to his belt, his experienced eyes reading the rising tension in the room. Dara sat forward in her chair, her dark eyes fixed on the Kesslers' backs, her legal pad forgotten in her lap. "Sir," Ms. Patterson said after several minutes, each word falling like a stone into still water, "the last medical record for any of these children was 18 months ago. A routine checkup for Isaiah Thompson. Nothing since then. No vaccinations, no dental visits, no emergency room visits, nothing." Her voice trembled with the weight of what she wasn't saying. Continued in next part due to length. A wave of murmurs rippled through the remaining courtroom personnel, like wind through dry leaves. The social worker present, a thin woman with graying hair who had earlier praised the Kesslers with effusive enthusiasm, had gone pale as paper, clutching her notebook to her chest as if it were a shield. Elliot suddenly pushed to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor like nails on a chalkboard. His earlier composure had cracked, revealing something darker underneath, something that made the bailiff take a half-step forward. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, his voice filling the courtroom, bouncing off the high ceiling. "We're being targeted because we're white and successful." His face had reddened to a dangerous shade, a vein pulsing visibly in his neck like a living thing. "You don't want us to help these children. You'd rather see them suffer in the system than succeed with us." Grace reached up to touch his arm, her perfectly polished nails glinting as she tried to calm him, but he shrugged her off with enough force to make her flinch. "We've given these kids everything," he continued, his voice rising to a near shout. "Structure, discipline, a chance at a real future. But that's not what you want to hear, is it?" The last words came out as almost a snarl. "Mr. Kessler!" Judge Reynolds' gavel crashed down, the sharp crack making Amara jump in her seat, her small hands clutching the edges of her chair. "You will sit down and be silent, or I will have you removed from this courtroom." The judge's normally composed face had hardened into granite. Elliot remained standing for a moment longer, chest heaving like a bull's, before slowly lowering himself back into his chair. The expensive fabric of his suit was now visibly wrinkled, his tie slightly askew. Grace's perfect smile had completely vanished now, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that made her look years older, the carefully applied makeup unable to hide the fear in her eyes. "This court is in recess for 30 minutes, Reynolds announced, bringing the gavel down once more with decisive force. "No one leaves the building. Bailiff, ensure Mr. and Mrs. Kessler remain in the courthouse." His voice carried the weight of steel. As people began to move, shuffling papers and whispering in hushed tones, Dara was already on her feet. She made her way through the shifting crowd toward the social worker, who was trying to slip out through the side door like a shadow. Dara caught up with her in the narrow hallway outside the courtroom, her footsteps echoing on the worn linoleum. "Ms. Wilson?" Dara called out, her voice firm but quiet, carrying just far enough to reach its target. The social worker stopped, turning slowly to face her like a prisoner facing judgment. Up close, Dara could see the sheen of sweat on the woman's forehead, the way her hands trembled slightly as they gripped her notebook, knuckles white against the spiral binding. "Did you actually visit their home?" Dara asked, holding the woman's gaze, her dark eyes unwavering. "For any of these children? Did you see them? Talk to them?" Each question fell like a hammer blow in the empty hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Ms. Wilson's face as she opened and closed her mouth, no words coming out. The truth was written clearly across her face, in the way her eyes couldn't quite meet Dara's, in the guilty flush spreading across her cheeks like a stain. Her silence spoke volumes more than any words could have. The fluorescent lights in the small conference room cast harsh shadows across Ms. Jenkins's face as she sat rigidly in her chair. Her hands twisted a tissue into shreds, little white pieces falling onto her navy skirt. Dara stood by the door while the court clerk, Ms. Patterson, arranged files on the table between them. "Ms. Jenkins," Dara began gently, "we need to understand exactly what happened with the Kesslers' home inspections. Lives may depend on it." The social worker's shoulders hunched forward. She looked older than her 50 years, the weight of something heavy pressing down on her. She started, then stopped, swallowing hard. Ms. Patterson leaned forward, her reading glasses catching the light. "Your signature is on these approval forms, all of them. 4 different children, 4 home studies, all signed off by you. The agency ... Ms. Jenkins's voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. "The agency was pushing to close cases. We were understaffed, overwhelmed with paperwork. The Kesslers had such good references. Church leaders, business owners, even a state representative." "But did you visit their home?" Dara pressed, moving closer to the table. "Did you see where the children would be living?" Tears welled up in Ms. Jenkins' eyes. Her hands stopped shredding the tissue, falling limply into her lap. "I never stepped inside the house," she whispered. "The agency signed off before I could." She looked up at Dara, her face twisted with shame. "They said the Kesslers were pre-approved. Premium clients. I tried to schedule visits, but there was always some excuse. Then suddenly the paperwork was processed, and I was assigned new cases." The confession hung in the air like smoke. Ms. Patterson made quick notes while Dara pulled out her phone to text Judge Reynolds. Within minutes, they were back in the courtroom. Reynolds's face was granite hard as he listened to Ms. Jenkins repeat her statement for the record. Without hesitation, he turned to the bailiff. "Contact Child Protective Services. I want an emergency welfare check on the Kessler residence now." The next 45 minutes crawled by like hours. The Kesslers sat separately now, each flanked by a deputy. Grace had pulled out a small Bible and appeared to be reading, her lips moving silently. Elliot stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle twitched steadily in his cheek. When the courtroom phone finally rang, everyone jumped. The bailiff answered, listened briefly, then approached the bench. He spoke quietly to Reynolds, but in the silent room, his words carried. Deputies found no children present at the residence, Your Honor, but they did find something concerning in a locked room on the second floor. The bailiff paused, checking his notes. The room contained multiple sets of folded children's clothing arranged by size. There was a wooden chair bolted to the floor in the center of the room. They found leather restraint straps attached to the chair. A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. Grace's Bible slipped from her hands, hitting the floor with a soft thud. Elliot's face had gone chalk white. Judge Reynolds removed his glasses slowly, placing them on the bench with deliberate care. When he spoke, his voice was low but carried the weight of thunder before a storm. Mr. and Mrs. Kessler, he looked at each of them in turn. I will ask you one more time. Where are the children? Elliot's throat worked but no sound came out. His hands gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles white against the dark wood. Grace looked up slowly. The afternoon light from the high windows caught her face, and something in her expression made Dara's skin crawl. There was no fear there, no guilt, only a serene certainty that chilled the room more than any show of panic could have. We gave them discipline, Grace said, her voice soft but clear. Each word fell into the silence like stones into still water. They were broken when they came to us, wild, undisciplined. A small smile touched her lips. We fixed them. Gasps rippled through the room. The court reporter's hands froze over her keyboard. Dara felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the implications of Grace's words sank in. Judge Reynolds's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Bailiff, take them into custody. Both defendants are to be detained for obstruction of justice. His voice rose over Grace's beginning protest. All adoption records involving the Kesslers are to be sealed and forwarded to the FBI. This is now a criminal investigation. As deputies moved forward with handcuffs, Grace continued to smile, that eerily peaceful smile. But Elliot finally broke his silence, surging to his feet with such force that his chair toppled backward. You can't do this, he shouted, struggling as deputies grabbed his arms. We saved them. We saved them from becoming... Remove them, Reynolds ordered sharply, cutting off whatever ugly truth was about to emerge from Elliot's mouth. Clear the courtroom. Dara watched as the Kesslers were led away in handcuffs. Grace walking serenely as if in a church procession, Elliot fighting each step until a deputy had to support his elbow. The contrast between them was jarring. One lost in righteous delusion, the other cracking under the weight of exposure. The sound of the heavy courtroom doors closing behind them echoed with grim finality. The fluorescent lights in the courthouse hallway cast harsh shadows as two officers led Grace and Elliot Kessler toward the holding cells. Grace walked with her head high, Bible clutched to her chest, while Elliot stumbled, his earlier confidence shattered. The sound of their footsteps echoed against the cold tile floors, mixing with the soft jingle of handcuffs. Down another corridor, a gentle-faced woman in her 30s guided Amara into a witness room decorated to feel less institutional. Soft blue walls displayed children's artwork. A shelf held stuffed animals and fidget toys. A small table near the window held crayons and paper. Dara followed close behind, carrying Amara's yellow backpack. She watched as the little girl's eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail, every possible exit, the watchfulness of a child who had learned to stay alert. Hi, Amara, the counselor said warmly, kneeling to the girl's eye level. I'm Ms. Sarah. Would you like to draw while we talk? Amara's fingers twisted in the fabric of her dress, but she nodded slightly. She chose a spot at the small table where she could see both the door and the window. Dara's heart ached at the careful calculation in such a young child's movements. I'll be right outside, Dara said softly, meeting Amara's eyes. You're safe here. A tiny nod was her only response, but as Dara turned to leave, Amara's small voice stopped her. Stay? The word was barely a whisper. Dara looked to Ms. Sarah, who nodded approval. Of course I'll stay, Dara said, settling into a chair near the table. She watched as Amara selected a black crayon and began drawing careful, controlled lines on the paper. In his chambers, Judge Reynolds sat at his desk, tie loosened, jacket discarded over a chair. The afternoon sun slanted through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the stack of files before him. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder Dara had discovered. The Kesslers' cloud account had been easy to access. They'd used the same password for everything, convinced of their own righteousness. What Reynolds found inside made his stomach turn. The folder was labeled simply, Obedience Logs. Inside were meticulously organized subfolders for each child, Kaylin, Isaiah, Suri, and now the beginnings of one for Amara. Reynolds clicked on Isaiah's folder first. The entries were detailed, clinical. Day 1. Excessive crying and resistance to correction. Implemented sleep management protocol. Day 15, still showing defiance, increased isolation time. Day 32. Continues attempts at cultural expressions. Additional cleaning duties assigned. Day 47. Finally silent. 1 week without screaming. Progress noted. Each entry included behavior ratings, punishment schedules, and something called identity compliance metrics. Grace's precise language couldn't disguise the horror beneath the surface, children being systematically broken down and rebuilt. Suri's folder contained similar logs with phrases like heritage detachment proceeding as planned and cultural regression achieved. Kaylin's latest entry was dated 6 months ago. Full compliance achieved, no further logs needed. Reynolds pushed back from his desk, running a hand over his face. In 30 years on the bench, he'd seen countless cases of abuse, but this calculated erasure of children's identities struck him to his core. This wasn't impulsive cruelty or neglect. This was methodical, purposeful destruction. He pressed the intercom button. "Get me Detective Hill," he ordered his clerk, immediately. 20 minutes later, Detective Marcus Hill stood in Reynolds' chambers, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the late afternoon light. His dark suit was immaculate, his bearing military straight, but his eyes held a weary knowledge as he reviewed the files. 3 years ago, Hill said, his deep voice controlled but tight with anger, I submitted a report about a pattern I was seeing. Black children being placed with wealthy white families who looked perfect on paper. Children who then seemed to disappear. Not physically, but something in them would go quiet. Dead-eyed. When I tried to investigate, the cases would get buried, classified as cultural adjustment issues. Reynolds remembered dismissing similar concerns in his own courtroom, hiding behind legal precedent and colorblind platitudes. The weight of that willful blindness pressed down on him now. Hill scrolled through the logs, his jaw clenching. "Look at this language," he said, pointing to a passage. "Subject shows promising response to identity correction. Cultural contamination successfully contained. They weren't trying to parent these children, they were trying to erase them." He straightened up, fixing Reynolds with a steady gaze. "This wasn't adoption," he said, each word deliberate and heavy with truth. "This was control." Reynolds nodded slowly, the full scope of what they were dealing with settling over the room like a dark cloud. The Kesslers hadn't just hidden their abuse behind respectability. They'd wrapped it in righteousness, turned it into a mission. And the system, his system, had handed them child after child. Hill gathered the printouts into a file, his movements precise and controlled. "I'll need everything you have. Every record, every report, every piece of correspondence with the adoption agency. We're going to find those children." He paused at the door. "And Judge, this time, don't let anyone bury it." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the chambers as Reynolds watched Hill leave. The ceiling fan spun slowly overhead, stirring the air but doing nothing to dispel the heavy weight of responsibility settling over him. The evidence sat in neat stacks on his desk, a paper trail of systematic destruction hidden behind perfect paperwork and polite smiles. Detective Hill's fingers flew across his keyboard, crafting the emergency alert that would ripple across state lines. The office hummed with urgent activity as his team coordinated with agencies across the Southeast. 3 children's faces stared out from his monitor: Kaylin's shy smile, Suri's solemn eyes, Isaiah's confident grin. School photos from before the Kesslers, before the light in their eyes dimmed. "Send units to both locations," Hill instructed his lead officer. "The camp first. It's more isolated." He studied the satellite view of the Alabama property, a former religious retreat center tucked away in dense forest. The second site, an abandoned church building on the outskirts of Atlanta, looked equally promising for hiding children. Officer Chen nodded, already on her radio. "CPS teams are en route. Local authorities have been notified. We're treating this as a potential trafficking situation." Hill's jaw tightened. He'd seen too many cases where children vanished into private, religious institutions that operated outside normal oversight. The Kesslers' careful paper trail had finally cracked, revealing a network of properties and shell companies all dedicated to their twisted mission of saving children by erasing their identities. The Alabama tactical team reached the camp first. Their body cam footage streamed live to Hill's laptop. Officers moving through empty dormitories, past walls covered with Bible verses about obedience. The building seemed deserted until they reached the old chapel. "Detective," the team leader's voice crackled through the feed. "We've found something." The camera panned across what had once been a prayer room, now converted into a sparse cell. 2 thin mattresses lay on the floor, a bucket in the corner, and huddled together in the far corner, 2 small figures in identical gray clothing. "Kaylin. Suri?" The officer approached slowly, hands visible. "We're here to help you." Suri, now 11, pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself smaller. Her once bouncy curls had been cut severely short. Beside her, 9-year-old Kaylin stood perfectly still, face blank, hands folded exactly as they'd been trained. "They're dehydrated but stable," the medic reported. "No immediate medical emergencies, but they'll need full evaluations." Hill watched as the girls were carefully led outside to waiting ambulances. Their movements were mechanical, rehearsed, like perfectly programmed dolls. Suri flinched at every sudden sound or movement. Kaylin hadn't spoken a word. But Isaiah wasn't there. The search teams combed every inch of the property. In what appeared to be an office, they found a large map mounted on the wall. Red pins marked locations across several states, treatment centers, and behavioral modification programs. One pin stood out circled in thick marker: El Paso, Texas. "Get me everything on that Texas location," Hill ordered, already reaching for his phone. "And someone bring me those pins. Each one might be another facility hiding children." The courthouse was quiet when the hearing reconvened, heavy with the weight of what had been discovered. Judge Reynolds sat at the bench, his usual commanding presence softened by evident fatigue. The gallery held only essential personnel: court officers, CPS workers, and a handful of investigators. In the witness room, Amara sat close to Dara, coloring with careful precision. Through the observation window, they could see the proceedings on closed-circuit TV. Grace and Elliot Kessler had been brought back in, still in handcuffs, their earlier righteousness cracked but not completely broken. Reynolds cleared his throat, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "This court has received evidence regarding the whereabouts of 3 minor children previously adopted by the defendants." He paused, looking directly at the Kesslers. "Kaylin and Suri have been recovered from an unlicensed facility in Alabama. They are currently receiving medical care and will be placed in protective custody." Grace's shoulders stiffened at the news. Elliot stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. "Isaiah," Reynolds continued, his tone hardening, "has not yet been located. Evidence suggests he was transferred to what the defendants term a correctional boarding program in El Paso, Texas. Federal authorities have been notified and are investigating all facilities in that area." He shuffled the papers before him, though everyone knew he didn't need to read what came next. "In light of these findings, and the overwhelming evidence of systematic abuse, this court hereby terminates all parental rights of Elliot and Grace Kessler. Full protective custody of Amara Williams is awarded to the state of Georgia, pending placement with qualified foster parents. In the witness room, Amara's crayon stilled on the paper. She looked up at the screen, watching as the Kesslers were led away. Her small fingers gripped the black crayon tightly. "They wanted to make me disappear too," she whispered to Dara, her voice carrying years of understanding no child should have to bear. Dara pulled her chair closer, offering silent support while being careful not to crowd the girl's space. On Amara's paper, she had drawn 4 figures in gray clothes, their faces blank circles without features. Above them, in careful letters, she had written, "The Quiet Children." Detective Hill's office buzzed with early morning activity. Multiple screens displayed maps, satellite imagery, and police reports. Coffee cups littered his desk, evidence of a sleepless night spent coordinating with Texas authorities. "New Dawn Reformation School," Hill muttered, studying the aerial photos of a sprawling compound nestled against the Franklin Mountains. High walls surrounded dormitory-style buildings, and a chapel dominated the center. No playground equipment, no sports fields, just concrete and control. His computer chimed with an incoming video call. Dara's face appeared, looking tired but determined. Behind her, the courthouse's law library provided a backdrop of leather-bound volumes. "Morning, Detective," she said, adjusting her webcam. "Judge Reynolds just signed the interstate cooperation order. Texas authorities can move as soon as you give the word." Hill nodded, spreading out the facility's documentation. "Their paperwork is pristine on the surface, licensed as a private religious academy, tax-exempt status. But look at this." He held up a financial record. "The Kesslers made a wire transfer 3 months ago, $50,000 marked as behavioral intervention." "That's when Isaiah disappeared from their home," Dara confirmed, checking her notes. "The Kesslers listed him as transferred to private education, but never filed actual school registration papers." Judge Reynolds joined the video call, his usual formal demeanor showing cracks of genuine concern. "Detective Hill, you have full authority to coordinate with El Paso law enforcement. If Isaiah is in that facility, get him out, today." Hill's team had already established a command center in El Paso, working with local SWAT and child welfare officials. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert as they gathered for the final briefing. "Remember," Hill's voice carried through their earpieces, "this is a rescue operation. These children are victims, not criminals. Many will be traumatized. Move carefully, speak softly, and document everything." At precisely 9:15 a.m., police vehicles surrounded the compound. A helicopter circled overhead as officers approached the main gate. The facility's director, a stern-faced woman in a pressed suit, met them with rehearsed indignation. "This is a private religious institution," she protested, clutching a thick policy manual. "You have no right to interfere with our disciplinary methods." The search warrant said otherwise. Teams moved systematically through the buildings. They found classrooms with chairs bolted to the floor, dormitories with metal beds and cameras in every corner, a reflection room with padding on the walls and restraint hooks mounted at child height. In the basement level, behind a heavy door marked intensive correction, they found Isaiah. The room was barely bigger than a closet. A thin mattress lay on the concrete floor. Religious texts lined a small shelf, the only reading material allowed. Isaiah sat perfectly straight on the cot, hands folded in his lap just as he'd been trained. His once bright eyes were dull, his cheekbones sharp from weight loss. "Isaiah?" The officer knelt slowly, keeping his distance. "We're here to help you. You're safe now." Isaiah didn't move at first, as if waiting for permission. Bruises marked his arms. "Disciplinary holds," the staff would later claim. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Did I earn outside time?" The officer's body camera captured it all. The sparse room, the haunted look in the boy's eyes, the way he flinched at sudden movements. In the command center, Hill watched the feed with clenched fists. "Get him out of there," he ordered. "Now!" The facility's staff tried to explain. They had papers signed by the Kesslers, authorizing whatever means necessary to correct Isaiah's defiant nature. Daily logs detailed their methods: isolation, sleep deprivation, forced scripture memorization, physical restraints. "We were saving him," the director insisted as she was led to a patrol car, breaking his willfulness, teaching him submission. Hill's voice was ice. "You were breaking his spirit and you're under arrest." A medical helicopter was already waiting. Isaiah needed immediate care, dehydration, malnutrition, untreated injuries. He clutched a small Bible during the flight, not because he wanted to read it, but because he feared punishment if he let it go. Hours later, in a Georgia children's hospital, Isaiah lay in a real bed for the first time in months. Nurses spoke softly around him. No one forced him to recite verses. No one twisted his arms when he moved wrong. He kept waiting for the gentleness to be a trick. In an adjacent wing, Amara sat with Dara, drawing pictures while they waited for news. She hadn't spoken much since learning they'd found Isaiah, but her drawings told stories. Children emerging from dark places into light, stick figures holding hands, doors standing open. When they told her Isaiah was stable enough for a brief visit, she walked quietly to the observation window. Isaiah lay facing away from the glass, still holding himself carefully, as if afraid to take up space. Amara pressed her small hand against the window. Her breath fogged the glass as she whispered, "You're real." Isaiah turned at the sound. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, relief, a spark of the boy he'd been before. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and placed his palm against the glass, matching her hand. They stayed that way for a long moment, two children separated by glass but connected by understanding. No words were needed. They both knew the silence of survival, the weight of being unmade and renamed, the fierce hope of being found. In their shared reflection, their hands seemed to touch through the barrier, a promise of healing, a bridge across pain, a quiet defiance of those who tried to make them disappear. Judge Daniel Reynolds sat alone in his chambers, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across his mahogany desk. The events of the past few days had stirred something deep within him, a discomfort he'd long suppressed. With trembling hands, he reached for the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, the one that stayed locked, the one he tried not to think about. The key felt heavy in his palm. For 10 years, he'd carried it like a silent burden. The drawer opened with a metallic groan, as if protesting the disturbance of its contents. Inside, beneath a stack of yellowed papers, lay a manila folder labeled Patterson versus State. Reynolds pulled it out slowly, feeling the weight of more than just paper. The edges were worn, the label faded, but the memories it contained remained sharp as ever. He spread the documents across his desk, each page a reminder of decisions made with clinical detachment. Lena Patterson's face stared back at him from an old photograph paperclipped to the file. A black woman in her early 50s, her eyes held a grandmother's warmth and determination. She'd appeared before him a decade ago, seeking custody of her mixed-race grandchild after the death of her daughter. His hands shook slightly as he read through the court transcripts. Lena's testimony jumped off the page. "That child is my blood, my heart. I raised my daughter alone, worked 3 jobs to put her through college. I know how to love a child, how to give them roots and wings." The social worker's report noted Lena's steady employment, her church involvement, her deep connection with her grandchild. But Reynolds remembered how he'd focused instead on what he'd called stability factors. Her single status, her age, her modest income. His own ruling lay at the bottom of the file, typed in formal language that now felt like a mask for something darker. He read his words aloud, each one falling heavy in the quiet room. While the court acknowledges the biological connection between Mrs. Patterson and the minor child, preference must be given to placement in a stable, 2-parent Caucasian home. The emotional connections of biological kin are not sufficient to override considerations of optimal developmental environment. Reynolds pushed back from his desk, the chair scraping against the floor. Behind those carefully chosen words, he now saw what he'd refused to acknowledge then: bias wrapped in the language of neutrality, prejudice disguised as procedure. He pulled out the follow-up reports, each one a damning piece of evidence against his decision. The child had been placed with the Whitman family, a placement that looked perfect on paper: white, middle class, church-going. 3 months later, the first abuse report was filed. 6 months after that, a neighbor reported screaming in the night. By the 1-year mark, the child had vanished from the system entirely. Reynolds found himself staring at the last known photograph, a school picture of a smiling 7-year-old who trusted the system to protect them. A child who disappeared because he, Daniel Reynolds, had decided that love and blood meant less than his notion of an optimal environment. The afternoon light had shifted, casting the room in deeper shadows. Reynolds gathered the scattered papers with unsteady hands. Each document felt heavier than before, weighted with consequences he'd chosen not to see. He reached for his phone, dialing a number he rarely used. "Judge Banks? Mildred? I need to meet with you. Today. It's important." An hour later, Judge Mildred Banks sat across from him, her presence filling his chambers with an authority that came from decades of fighting for justice within a system that often resisted it. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. Reynolds pushed the Patterson file across his desk. His voice, usually so measured in court, cracked slightly. "I made decisions believing I was being neutral. I wasn't." Judge Banks picked up the file, her expression grave as she examined its contents. She'd seen too many cases like this, children of color separated from loving families in the name of better opportunities. Her own mother had lost cousins to similar decisions decades ago. She looked up at Reynolds, measuring the man before her, a colleague she'd known for years, now finally seeing the cracks in his carefully constructed worldview. "Then you'll need to help fix what you broke," she said simply, her voice carrying both challenge and possibility. The Georgia Judicial Ethics Review Board meeting room felt both grand and stifling. Ornate wooden panels lined the walls, and a massive conference table dominated the space. 14 board members, 12 white, 2 black, sat in high-backed leather chairs, their expressions carefully neutral as Judge Banks stood at the podium. "What we're presenting today isn't just about individual cases," Banks began, her voice steady and firm. "It's about patterns that have torn families apart for generations." Reynolds stood beside her, looking different than he had just weeks ago. The crisp authority that usually marked his presence had softened into something more human, more vulnerable. He placed a thick stack of folders on the table. "These are cases from my own courtroom," he said, his voice quieter than usual but clear enough to carry. "I've highlighted rulings where I claimed to be following procedure, but was actually perpetuating harm." One of the board members, Judge Harrison, a silver-haired man who'd served for 30 years, leaned forward. "And what exactly constitutes harm in these instances?" Dara stepped up then, her laptop open. She'd spent days organizing the evidence into clear, undeniable patterns. The projector hummed to life, displaying a grid of statistics. "In the past decade," she explained, Black relatives seeking custody were denied at 7 times the rate of white applicants with similar qualifications. The most common reason cited was insufficient stability factors, even when the Black applicants had higher income and education levels. She clicked through to the next slide, and here are the outcomes. Photos of children appeared, dozens of them. 70% of the Black children denied to relatives and placed with white families later appeared in abuse reports. 40% disappeared from the system entirely. The room grew uncomfortably warm. Several board members shifted in their seats, avoiding eye contact. Judge Banks continued, her voice carrying decades of controlled anger. "We've also uncovered systematic suppression of complaints." She held up a thick folder. "These are reports from Black families about abuse in transracial adoptions, all marked unsubstantiated, without investigation, all buried in administrative loops until they expired." Judge Peterson, a woman with carefully styled blonde hair, raised her hand. "While this is concerning, we need to consider the context. These decisions were made within existing legal frameworks. We can't punish people for doing what was legal at the time." The tension in the room spiked. Judge Banks placed both hands on the podium, her knuckles whitening slightly. "Legal doesn't make it right," she said firmly. "Slavery was legal, segregation was legal. The law has often been used to justify the destruction of Black families." Another board member, Justice Williams, one of the 2 Black members, spoke up. "This wasn't just legal. It was systemic neglect of Black families. We're not talking about punishing individuals. We're talking about acknowledging harm and making it right." Reynolds stepped forward again. The room quieted. They all knew his reputation for measured, conservative rulings. "I've spent my career believing I was neutral," he said, his voice heavy with realization. "But neutrality in an unjust system only perpetuates injustice. The Kessler case opened my eyes. How many children did we hand over to abuse because we couldn't see past our own biases?" Dara pulled up another document, the Kessler's history of adoptions, now annotated with the children's testimonies. The room fell silent as they read the accounts of racial cleansing disguised as discipline. "This didn't happen in isolation," Dara said firmly. "The system enabled it. Every time we ignored a black grandmother's plea, every time we dismissed a mother's concerns as emotional, we paved the way for more abuse." The debate grew heated. Some board members argued for gradual change, others for immediate action. The discussion circled around terms like liability and precedent. Finally, Judge Banks cut through the noise. "We're not here to debate whether this happened. We're here to decide what we're going to do about it." She laid out a proposal, a comprehensive review of all adoption and custody rulings from the past 15 years, where racial bias might have played a role. A task force to track down children who disappeared from the system. New guidelines for transracial adoption oversight. The board members huddled in small groups, whispering intensely. Hours passed. Coffee cups emptied and filled again. Finally, Judge Harrison cleared his throat. "We've reached a decision," he announced. "The board agrees to establish a statewide review committee. All adoption and custody cases from the past 15 years involving potential racial bias will be examined." He turned to Judge Banks. "We'd like you to co-chair the task force." Banks nodded solemnly. "I accept." "And," Harrison continued, looking at Dara with newfound respect, "we're creating a new position, legal research lead. Ms. King, given your work on the Kessler case and this presentation, we'd like you to co-chair with Judge Banks." Dara straightened, her expression professional but her eyes bright with purpose. "I would be honored." All eyes turned to Reynolds, expecting him to take a leadership role. He shook his head slowly. "I appreciate the consideration," he said, "but I don't belong in charge of this. I'll testify instead. The task force needs to hear from those of us who were part of the problem. Only then can we truly be part of the solution." The meeting adjourned, but the weight of what they'd begun hung in the air. Decades of buried injustice were finally rising to the surface. The real work was just beginning. The trauma therapy room was painted in soft blues and greens with fluffy clouds stenciled on the walls. Sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains, casting gentle shadows across the carpeted floor where 3 little girls sat in a circle. Art supplies were scattered between them, fresh sheets of white paper, colorful markers, and crayons of every shade imaginable. Dr. Sarah Chen, the child trauma specialist, sat with them on a cushion, her presence calm and steady. She wore a sweater with tiny elephants embroidered on it, the kind of detail children often noticed and found comforting. "There's no right or wrong way to draw," she said softly. "Just put on the paper whatever's in your heart today." Amara picked up a brown crayon first, her small hand gripping it with purpose. Her strokes were careful, deliberate. She drew the outline of a girl, brown skin, curly hair, a dress that looked like the one she wore to court. Then, with slow, measured lines, she began drawing a glass jar around the figure, trapping her inside. Beside her, Kaylin stared at her blank paper for a long time before choosing a black marker. Her drawings were sharp, angular, harsh lines that spoke of anger held too long. She drew what looked like a prayer room, but the windows had bars. Suri, the oldest, kept her eyes down, shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear. Her hand trembled as she reached for the colors. She started drawing flowers, but they weren't bright or cheerful. They were wilting, drawn in muted grays and browns. In the corner, at a separate table, Isaiah worked with his own art supplies. Still recovering from his time in Texas, he moved carefully, mindful of healing bruises. He chose a red marker, bold and defiant, and drew a house. White, with perfect shutters just like the Kesslers. Then, with firm strokes that nearly tore the paper, he drew a large X across it. Dr. Chen watched them work, taking gentle notes. She noticed how they positioned themselves, always able to see the door, never turning their backs to the room. Even in this safe space, their bodies remembered the need to stay alert. "Would anyone like to tell me about their drawing?" she asked, keeping her voice soft and open. Amara touched her picture gently. "She can't get out," she whispered. "They put her in there to make her clean." Kaylin pointed to her barred windows. "That's where they made us pray. All day sometimes, until our knees hurt." Suri's flowers seemed to droop more as she spoke. "They said pretty things die if they're not fixed. They said we needed fixing." Isaiah held up his ex-ed outhouse. "I'm never going back," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Never." Later that afternoon, the children were brought one by one into Judge Reynolds' courtroom. The gallery had been cleared. Only essential court staff, Dr. Chen and a victim advocate remained. The children would not have to face the Kesslers or a crowd of strangers. Kaylin went first. She sat in the witness chair, her feet barely touching the ground. Her voice was small but clear as she described the cleaning rituals, harsh baths with bleach soap that left her skin raw and burning. "They said black skin holds dirt deeper," she recounted. "They said they had to scrub the bad out." Suri followed, her testimony focusing on the prayer punishments. "We had to kneel for hours," she explained. "If we moved or cried, they said we were letting the devil win. They said black children have more devil in them." Isaiah's statement was taken from his hospital room via video link. Still too weak to travel, he described the progression from the Kesslers' house to the Texas facility. "They said I was too angry, too black angry. That's what they called it. They said they'd pray it out of me or beat it out." Amara was the last to testify. She sat very straight in the big chair, her yellow dress smooth and neat. Unlike her previous silence in court, today she spoke with quiet determination. "Mrs. Grace said black girls don't know how to be clean or proper," she said. "She made us practice being white, how to talk, how to sit, how to pray. She said God made us wrong, but she would fix us." The consistency in their stories was haunting. Different details, different experiences, but the same theme ran through them all: the systematic attempt to erase their identity, to cleanse them of their blackness through abuse disguised as discipline. The court reporter's fingers moved steadily over her keyboard, but tears ran down her face. Dr. Chen maintained her professional composure, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her notepad. The victim advocate had to step out twice to collect herself. Judge Reynolds sat through it all, his usual judicial detachment cracking with each testimony. He asked questions when necessary, always gentle, always careful not to re-traumatize. But those who knew him could see how deeply the children's words affected him. When the last statement was recorded, a heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Reynolds looked down at the case file, now thick with testimonies, medical reports, and Dr. Chen's psychological evaluations. His hands trembled slightly as he closed it. He looked up, his face showing every hour of testimony he'd heard, every piece of evidence he'd reviewed. The polished veneer of judicial objectivity had been stripped away, leaving raw humanity in its place. "Let the record show," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The children were never lost. The system just refused to see them." He reached for his gavel but paused as if the weight of it had suddenly changed. "This transcript will be sealed to protect the children's privacy and future well-being." He took a deep breath. "Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate initiation of civil action against Elliot and Grace Kessler, as well as the Happy Homes Adoption Agency, for criminal negligence, child endangerment, and systematic abuse." The gavel fell, its sound echoing through the silent courtroom. But this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of accountability, of facing hard truths too long ignored. The morning sun had barely crept over Atlanta's skyline when the news exploded across Georgia. Every local station interrupted their regular programming with breaking news banners. Cell phones buzzed with alerts. Social media feeds filled with shared headlines. Kessler's arrested in adoption abuse scandal. Prominent couple charged with child abuse. Missing children found, adoption system under fire. Outside the limestone courthouse, news vans created a makeshift media city. Satellite dishes pointed skyward, cables snaked across the sidewalk, and reporters in pressed suits did their stand-ups for morning shows. Camera crews jostled for the best angles, their equipment glinting in the early light. But inside the children's protective facility across town, the morning unfolded in peaceful quiet. Amara sat at a small table, carefully coloring a picture of a butterfly. Sunlight streamed through windows covered with cheerful rainbow stickers. The TV remained off, the phones silenced. The staff had created a protective bubble around the children, shielding them from the growing media storm. Kaylin and Suri played nearby with wooden blocks, building towers that reached toward the ceiling. Isaiah rested in the medical wing, his strength returning a little more each day. A social worker watched them all with gentle attention, noting how they were beginning to relax. Small shoulders losing their tension, voices growing slightly louder, laughs coming more freely. "Would anyone like apple slices?" the care worker asked, keeping her voice light and warm. 3 small hands raised immediately, a simple gesture that spoke volumes about growing trust. Across town in the courthouse press room, Judge Mildred Banks stood at a podium, her posture straight and dignified. Dara stood slightly behind her, wearing a charcoal suit that spoke of both professionalism and determination. Camera flashes punctuated the air like lightning. "The children are safe," Judge Banks stated firmly, her voice carrying authority and compassion in equal measure. "They are receiving appropriate care and support. We will not be sharing their identities or personal details. Their privacy and healing come first." Reporters' hands shot up, questions overlapping. How many children were involved? What about other adoptive families? Will there be a broader investigation? Dara stepped forward, her words measured and clear. "We're conducting a thorough review of the system. Our focus is on protecting vulnerable children and ensuring accountability. That's all we can say at this time." Meanwhile, in a private room at Morton's Steakhouse downtown, 12 white parents sat around a long table, their faces drawn with worry. They'd chosen this restaurant carefully, expensive enough to ensure privacy, far enough from the courthouse to avoid notice. Their whispered conversations carried edges of panic. "We did everything by the book," one woman insisted, twisting her napkin. "Our adoption was legal." "But what if they start looking at everyone?" another asked. "What if they question our methods?" A man in an expensive suit leaned forward. "We're good parents. We give these children better lives. They can't punish us for that." The word "these" hung in the air, heavy with unexamined bias. A younger mother dabbed at her eyes. "I just want my son to fit in. Is that so wrong?" None of them noticed the black server who silently refilled their water glasses, his face carefully blank as he absorbed their fears. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Judge Reynolds walked alone through the growing crowd. He'd removed his judicial robes, wearing a simple gray suit that helped him blend in, but his face carried the weight of everything he'd learned, everything he'd been forced to confront. The protesters filled both sides of the wide stone steps. Their signs rose like a forest of accusations and demands. "Listen to black children. Stop colorblind courts. End adoption abuse. Justice for our babies. White saviors are not saviors." Some protesters recognized him. Whispers rippled through the crowd. A few people pointed, their expressions mixed, some angry, others hopeful. A reporter stepped forward with a microphone, but Reynolds turned away without comment. His steps measured and deliberate as he walked into the gathering dusk. Behind him, Dara stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by microphones and cameras. Her voice carried clearly over the crowd's murmur. "This case isn't about revenge," she stated firmly. "It's about justice, about seeing what's been hidden and fixing what's been broken. It's about making sure every child is truly protected, not just on paper, but in reality." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the assembled media. "The color of a child's skin should never determine their safety or their worth, and the color of an adult's skin should never automatically grant them trust or authority over vulnerable lives." The crowd grew quiet, absorbing her words. In that moment, as the sun set behind Atlanta's skyline, The weight of change hung in the air, heavy with both promise and challenge. The morning of the trial arrived with an electric tension in the air. By 7 a.m., a line already wrapped around the courthouse, filled with reporters, activists, and local citizens hoping to witness history. Security guards checked IDs and conducted thorough searches, their faces stern with the weight of the day's importance. Inside the historic courtroom, with its dark wood paneling and high windows, every seat filled quickly. National reporters from major networks claimed the front rows, their notepads ready and phones silenced. Local journalists squeezed into remaining spaces while sketch artists set up their easels near the jury box. Judge Marcus Thompson, known for his strict courtroom decorum, surveyed the packed gallery. His salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him a scholarly appearance, but his eyes held steel. He'd been specifically appointed to handle this high-profile case, and his reputation for fairness preceded him. At precisely 9 o'clock, the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." The Kesslers entered separately, each flanked by their legal team. Elliot wore an expensive charcoal suit that seemed to emphasize his rigid posture. His face remained impassive as he took his seat, but his jaw worked constantly, grinding tension. Grace floated in like a ghost in pristine white. A cardigan pulled tight across her shoulders, pressed slacks, pearl earrings. Her face might have been carved from marble for all the emotion it showed. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap as if attending a garden party rather than her own trial. The proceedings began with opening statements. The district attorney, Sarah Chen, stood before the jury, her voice clear and measured. "This case is about power and control disguised as love," she began. "About children who were promised homes but given prisons. About a system that failed to protect our most vulnerable because it was blinded by privilege and prejudice." The defense painted a different picture, one of misunderstanding and persecution. Elliot's attorney spoke of cultural differences and firm but fair discipline. Grace's lawyer emphasized their Christian values and dedication to helping troubled children. When asked to enter their pleas, Elliot's voice filled the courtroom with unwavering conviction. Not guilty. The words seemed to bounce off the walls, hollow and hard. Grace merely nodded when it was her turn, requiring the judge to ask her to speak aloud. Her "not guilty" came out barely above a whisper. The prosecution's evidence began with audio recordings, dozens of them, captured by the children's tablet devices that had been set to automatically back up to cloud storage. The courtroom fell silent as the first recording played, Grace's voice sweet as poison. "Now what do we say when we're sorry for being difficult?" A child's trembling response, "I reject my darkness and choose the light." Again, "I reject my darkness and choose the light." Once more, "Mean it this time." Another recording captured the sound of a wooden chair scraping across floor tiles, followed by Grace's sing-song instructions. "Sit still. No moving. No speaking. God is watching. 3 hours starts now." The silence that followed on the tape was deafening, broken only by occasional whimpers and the sound of small bodies shifting against wood. Elliot's voice appeared in other recordings, his tone cold and controlling. "Your kind of people need structure. You should be grateful we're teaching you better ways." The jury members' faces reflected growing horror as recording after recording played. One juror, an elderly black woman, pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. Another, a middle-aged white man, couldn't seem to stop shaking his head. Then came Patricia Wheeler, the surprise witness. A former neighbor of the Kesslers, she clutched her purse tightly as she took the stand. Her testimony came out in nervous bursts. "I saw them moving children at night," she said, voice trembling. 3 times, maybe 4. Always after midnight. The children were so quiet, walking like little soldiers to the car. I told myself maybe they were going on vacation, but..." She paused, swallowing hard. "They never came back." "Did you report what you saw?" the prosecutor asked. "I called the police once," Patricia admitted. "They said the Kesslers were upstanding citizens, that I should mind my own business. I should have done more." The afternoon session focused on Grace's testimony. She sat in the witness box, still wearing her white cardigan like armor, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her answers came in soft, measured tones that never quite reached her eyes. When asked about the bathroom incidents, the bleaching, the harsh scrubbing, she smiled faintly. Children need to learn cleanliness, some more than others. The prosecutor held up photos of the children's rashed skin. "Is this cleanliness, Mrs. Kessler?" Grace's smile never wavered. Sometimes medicine tastes bitter. Then came the question that seemed to stop time in the courtroom. The prosecutor stood directly before Grace, blocking her view of Elliot. "Mrs. Kessler, do you regret anything you did to these children?" Grace's response came out soft as falling snow. "We tried to help them be good." Judge Thompson's glare could have melted steel. Several jurors visibly recoiled. Even Grace's own attorney seemed to flinch. The final evidence of the day came in a large manila envelope, drawings from the children's therapy sessions. As they were displayed on a large screen, a collective gasp rose from the gallery. Isaiah's artwork showed stick figures in dark rooms, faces crossed out with angry red lines. Suri had drawn herself as a tiny dot surrounded by towering black shapes. Kaylin's picture featured a house with bars on all the windows. But it was Amara's drawing that captured the room's full attention. A small brown figure trapped inside a glass jar, looking out with wide, sad eyes. Across the top, in careful child's handwriting, were the words, "Fix me." The prosecutor placed the original drawing into evidence with gentle hands. Tomorrow, it would appear on front pages across the country, becoming the singular image that captured the entire tragic story. As the day's session ended, Grace stood smoothly, adjusting her cardigan with perfect poise. Elliot's face had turned to stone. The gallery buzzed with whispered conversations as security began clearing the courtroom. Outside, the setting sun painted the courthouse steps in shades of amber and shadow. Reporters rushed to file their stories, photographers checked their shots, and protesters held their signs higher in the fading light. The trial's first day was over, but its echoes would resonate far beyond the courtroom walls. The Georgia Judicial Task Force meeting room felt heavy with tension. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished conference table where 24 legal professionals sat reviewing thick stacks of documents. At the head of the table, Dara stood beside a projected screen, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to present. "Over the past 5 years," she began, clicking to the first slide, "Hope Tree Adoption Agency processed 127 transracial adoptions. Of these, 83 involved black children placed with white families." She paused, letting the number sink in. "What happened next is where the system failed completely." Judge Banks leaned forward in her chair, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. The other task force members, a mix of judges, attorneys, and child welfare experts, followed suit as Dara continued. Of these 83 children, none, not a single one, received the mandatory 6-month follow-up visits. Dara's finger traced down a column of empty checkboxes. No welfare checks, no home visits, no interviews with the children themselves. A murmur rippled through the room. One committee member, a veteran family court judge, removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "How did this slip through?" he asked, his voice heavy with disbelief. Dara clicked to the next slide. The agency marked these cases as successfully closed upon placement. They collected their fees and moved on. Her voice took on an edge of controlled anger. These children essentially disappeared into a bureaucratic black hole. Judge Banks stood up, walking closer to examine the projected data. Her normally composed demeanor showed cracks of fury. "This isn't oversight," she declared. "This is systematic abandonment." The presentation continued with devastating precision. Dara showed graphs of placement speeds, how black children were rushed through the system at 3 times the rate of white children. She displayed approval statistics showing white couples fast-tracked while black relatives were delayed or denied. "The pattern is clear," Dara concluded. "These weren't adoptions. They were transactions." Judge Banks took control of the meeting, her voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench. "We need complete policy overhaul. Every single step of the adoption process needs to be rebuilt with accountability at its core." Across town in Hope Tree's gleaming office building, The agency's leadership held their own emergency meeting. Their PR team crafted careful statements denying any wrongdoing, while lawyers prepared defenses about standard industry practices and resource limitations. But Dara had already anticipated their response. Back in the task force meeting, she opened her laptop and projected a new set of documents. Internal emails recovered from Hopetree's servers. The first email appeared on screen dated 3 years ago. Patterson girl, 6, fast-track placement potential. Good optics for year-end report. White Christian couple, high income, connected to donors. Another email thread discussed Amara. Perfect candidate for quick processing. Current foster family, black grandmother, lacking resources. Kessler's offer better demographic profile. The room grew deathly quiet as more emails appeared. Hopetree staff discussed children-like inventory, rating prospective parents on presentation scores, and community standing. One administrator had created a spreadsheet ranking families by cultural desirability, with white, wealthy couples consistently at the top. Judge Banks's voice cut through the silence. This ends today. She turned to the task force's legal counsel. Draft an emergency suspension order for Hopetree's license and contact the DA's office. These falsified reports constitute criminal fraud. The task force moved with unprecedented speed. By afternoon, formal recommendations were drafted demanding immediate action. Hopetree's license suspension, criminal investigations into key staff members, and a complete audit of all adoptions processed in the past decade. Outside the courthouse, something remarkable was happening. Local artists had begun work on a massive mural spanning the building's east wall. 4 silhouettes emerged in bold colors: Amara, Isaiah, Kaylin, and Suri, their faces turned upward toward a rising sun. Beneath the mural, someone had written in flowing script, "They were not invisible. You just didn't look." People gathered to watch the artists' work. Some brought flowers, others left notes. A group of black foster parents organized a vigil, lighting candles as the sun set. Inside, Dara stood at a window watching the scene below. Judge Banks joined her, both women silent for a moment. "You know what makes me angriest," Dara finally said. "These children tried to tell us. They spoke up, drew pictures, showed their pain. The system just decided not to listen." Judge Banks nodded slowly. "Then we make sure the system can never turn away again." She held up the task force's recommendations. "This is just the beginning." The mural took shape as evening approached. The artists added details: butterflies emerging from shadows, broken chains transforming into birds, small hands reaching toward light. The children's silhouettes seemed to pulse with life against the brick wall. More people arrived, forming a crowd that spilled onto the courthouse lawn. Someone started singing, an old civil rights song that spread through the gathering. The artists kept working as the sky darkened, portable lights illuminating their progress. A news crew arrived to film the scene. Their camera caught the moment when the last words were painted beneath the mural. "Look, listen, learn." Inside the task force meeting room, members worked late into the night, drafting new protocols and safeguards. Every procedure was examined, every loophole addressed. They created requirements for post-placement monitoring, cultural competency training, and regular interviews with adopted children. Alone, away from adoptive parents. Dara's data projections remained on screen, a constant reminder of what happens when systems fail their most vulnerable. The numbers told a story of institutional blindness, but the faces in the mural outside told a story of survival and truth that could no longer be ignored. As night fell completely, the mural stood as a beacon in the darkness. 4 children, once hidden, now watched over the city, their presence impossible to overlook, their story impossible to forget. The Recovery Center's family meeting room looked nothing like the stark spaces where Amara had met with social workers before. Soft yellow walls held cheerful paintings of gardens and butterflies. Plush chairs formed a cozy circle around a low table scattered with art supplies and children's books. The morning sun streamed through gauzy curtains, creating pools of warm light on the carpeted floor. Amara sat in her favorite corner chair, legs tucked beneath her, watching the door. She wore a purple t-shirt with sparkly stars, her own choice from the donated clothes, and her hair was pulled back in 2 simple puffs. Her fingers traced patterns on the chair's fabric as she waited. When the door opened, Latrice Evans stepped in quietly. She wore blue scrubs with little hearts on the pockets, and her natural hair was styled in neat twists. A silver necklace with a small heart charm caught the sunlight. Her movements were gentle, careful not to startle. "Hi, Amara," Latrice said softly, staying near the door. "I'm Latrice. Is it okay if I come sit with you for a while?" Amara studied her face intently. She had learned to read adults quickly, their real feelings often hidden behind nice words, but Latrice's warm brown eyes held no pretense, just patient kindness. After a moment, Amara gave a small nod. Latrice chose a chair nearby, close enough to talk easily, but not so close as to crowd. She set her bag down and smiled. "Thank you for meeting with me today. I knew your mama, you know. She was my cousin, and she was one of the sweetest people I ever knew." At the mention of her mother, Amara's hands stilled on the chair fabric. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't speak. "She loved to sing," Latrice continued softly. "Used to know all the words to every Stevie Wonder song, and she could bake the best sweet potato pie you ever tasted." She paused, watching Amara's face. "Would you like to hear more about her?" Another tiny nod. Amara's shoulders relaxed just a fraction. "Well, she was smart as anything, always reading books, and she had the prettiest laugh, like music." Latrice's voice was gentle, weaving memories like a soft blanket. "When she found out she was having you, she was so happy she danced right there in the hospital hallway." A ghost of a smile touched Amara's lips. She uncurled slightly in her chair. "I tried to find you, baby," Latrice said quietly. 6 months ago, I filed papers to adopt you. But they said my nursing salary wasn't enough, even though I own my house. They said you needed 2 parents, not just one." Amara's dark eyes fixed on Latrice's face, searching. After a long moment, she whispered, "Did you want me?" "Oh, sweetheart." Latrice's voice was thick with emotion. "I wanted you so much. Still do." The child therapist who had been quietly observing from the corner spoke up. "Amara, would you like to show Ms. Latrice the courtyard? It's a beautiful morning for a walk." Amara slid from her chair and stood uncertainly. Latrice rose too, holding out her hand palm up, an offer, not a demand. After a moment's hesitation, Amara's small fingers curled into Latrice's. The recovery center's courtyard was a peaceful space, with winding paths between flower beds and benches placed in shady spots. A few butterflies danced among the blooms. Amara and Latrice walked slowly, matching each other's pace. They passed a flowering bush, and Amara reached out to touch a purple blossom. "Pretty," she murmured. "That's lantana," Latrice said. "My mama, your great auntie. She grew these in her garden. The butterflies love them." They walked a little further. Amara's grip on Latrice's hand had relaxed, but she didn't let go. Near a bench, she stopped suddenly and looked up at Latrice. "Do you know how to braid hair?" The question came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding it in. Latrice's laugh was warm and genuine. "Only the best box braids in Atlanta, baby girl. Been doing hair since I was knee-high to a grasshopper." Something magical happened then. Amara smiled. Not the careful, practiced smile she'd shown to social workers and judges, but a real one that lit up her whole face. Her eyes crinkled at the corners, and 2 small dimples appeared in her cheeks. "My mama used to braid my hair," she said softly, "before she got sick. She taught me how, you know," Latrice said. "Showed me all her special tricks for making the parts straight and the braids neat." They sat together on the bench, surrounded by the gentle sounds of birds and rustling leaves. Amara's feet swung back and forth, not quite reaching the ground. "Would you like me to braid your hair sometime?" Latrice asked. "When you're ready?" Amara nodded, her smile growing a little wider. "Can you do the heart shape in the front?" "Baby girl, I can do hearts, stars, whatever you want." Latrice's own smile matched Amara's. And I've got all your mama's old hair ties, the pretty ones with the colorful beads. They stayed in the courtyard until lunchtime, talking about small things, favorite colors, what kinds of birds they saw, whether chocolate or vanilla ice cream was better. When it was time to go back inside, Amara held Latrice's hand a little tighter. That evening, in her room at the recovery center, Amara sat at her small desk with her art supplies spread out before her. She chose her colors carefully: brown for the house, green for the tree, blue for the sky. Her small hands moved with purpose as she drew. The house took shape on the paper, warm and solid with a red door and flowers in the windows. Next came a tall tree with spreading branches, and from one branch, a swing. On the swing sat a little girl with brown skin and beaded braids. Beside the swing stood a woman with a kind smile and twists in her hair, pushing the little girl higher and higher. When Latrice came for their second meeting the next morning, Amara was waiting with the drawing carefully folded in her hands. She held it out without speaking. Latrice unfolded the paper gently. Her eyes grew soft as she took in every detail: the house, the tree, the two figures together in the sunlight. The marble halls of the courthouse felt heavier than usual that morning. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches where spectators sat in tense silence. The air conditioning hummed softly, barely masking the sound of shuffling papers and quiet whispers. Judge Reynolds sat straight-backed on the bench, his robes pressed and neat, but his face showed the weight of the past weeks. His fingers rested lightly on the sealed envelope containing the jury's verdict. The gallery was packed: reporters with notebooks poised, social workers who had testified, court staff who had helped uncover the truth. The Kesslers sat at the defense table, a study in controlled tension. Grace wore a modest navy dress, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her wedding ring catching the light. Elliot's jaw worked silently beneath his clean-shaven face, his expensive suit doing little to hide the rigid set of his shoulders. Their attorney shuffled papers, though there was nothing left to argue. In a quiet room at the recovery center across town, Amara sat close to Latrice on a comfortable couch, both watching the courtroom feed on a large screen. Latrice's arm curved protectively around the little girl's shoulders. A child therapist sat nearby, ready to help if the proceedings became too overwhelming. "All rise," the bailiff called out, his voice echoing in the hushed courtroom. The jury filed in slowly, 12 faces bearing the gravity of their decision. They avoided looking at the defendants, their eyes fixed straight ahead or down at their feet. The forewoman clutched a piece of paper in slightly trembling hands. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat. "In the matter of the state of Georgia versus Elliot and Grace Kessler, has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," the forewoman said, her voice clear but subdued. Reynolds broke the seal on the envelope with deliberate care. He read the contents silently first, his expression unchanging. Then, he handed the paper back to the clerk for the formal reading. "In the matter of child endangerment, how do you find guilty?" Grace's shoulders began to shake slightly. Elliot remained stone still. "In the matter of psychological abuse, guilty." At the recovery center, Amara pressed closer to Latrice, who squeezed her gently. "In the matter of fraudulent adoption practices, guilty." Grace's composed facade cracked. Tears began rolling down her cheeks, though she made no sound. "And in the matter of obstruction of child welfare investigations, guilty." The clerk finished reading. A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the courtroom. Elliot finally moved, his hand clenching into a fist on the table before him. Judge Reynolds spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the speakers at the recovery center. "The jury has found the defendants guilty on all counts. Sentencing will be scheduled for 2 weeks from today." He turned his full attention to the Kesslers. "Until then, you will remain in custody. The serious nature of these crimes, particularly those committed against vulnerable children placed in your care, will be reflected in your sentences." The lead prosecutor stood, straightening her jacket. "Your Honor, the state would like to recommend maximum sentences on all counts, to run consecutively rather than concurrently. The calculated nature of the defendant's actions the emotional destruction inflicted on multiple children over several years, and their continued attempts to hide their crimes all warrant the strongest possible punishment under the law. Reynolds nodded. Your recommendation is noted for the sentencing hearing. He paused, looking directly at the Kesslers. You were entrusted with society's most precious resource, its children. You betrayed that trust in ways that will echo through lives for generations. This court takes such betrayal very seriously. Grace was openly crying now, her shoulders heaving. Elliot stared straight ahead, his face a mask of stone, but his complexion had gone ashen. Their attorney placed a hand on Grace's shoulder, murmuring something neither microphone nor human ear could catch. As the bailiffs approached to lead the Kesslers away, Grace turned suddenly toward the gallery. We only wanted to help them, she said, her voice breaking. We wanted to make them better. Better than what, Mrs. Kessler? Reynolds asked sharply. Better than themselves? Better than their heritage? Better than the children God made them to be? He shook his head. Bailiffs, please proceed. At the recovery center, Latrice turned away from the screen and gathered Amara fully into her arms. The little girl buried her face in Latrice's shoulder, her small body trembling slightly. They can't hurt you anymore, Latrice whispered, rocking gently. You're safe now. You're safe and you're loved, exactly as you are. Amara nodded against her shoulder, her fingers curling into the soft fabric of Latrice's shirt. The therapist quietly turned off the video feed as the courtroom began to empty. Later that evening, after the press had gone home and the courthouse halls had grown quiet, Judge Reynolds sat alone in his chambers. The room was dark except for his desk lamp, casting a warm circle of light on the papers before him. His resignation letter was brief but clear, typed on official letterhead. I hereby submit my resignation from the position of Superior Court Judge, effective immediately following the sentencing hearing in State v. Kessler. It has been my honor to serve, but recent events have made clear the need for new perspectives and voices in our judicial system. Beside it lay a handwritten note addressed to Dara. Keep digging, we were never blind, we just chose not to see. He signed both documents with a steady hand, though weariness lined his face. The pen made a soft click as he set it down, the sound final in the quiet room. The late summer breeze carried the scent of jasmine through the quiet Atlanta neighborhood. Amara stood on the sidewalk, her small hand wrapped tightly in Latrice's, taking in the sight before her. The house wasn't big or fancy, just a neat one-story home with warm brown siding and white trim, surrounded by well-tended flower beds. But what made Amara's breath catch was the oak tree in the front yard, its sturdy branches supporting a wooden swing that swayed gently in the afternoon air. Just like her drawing, the swing's ropes were new, the wood freshly sanded and sealed. Latrice had spent the weekend before getting it ready, wanting everything to be perfect for this moment. A brand new purple backpack hung from the porch railing, decorated with silver stars. Amara had picked it out herself during their back-to-school shopping trip. What do you think, sweetheart? Latrice asked softly, giving Amara's hand a gentle squeeze. Amara took a small step forward, her eyes wide as she studied every detail. The garden had black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers, the same flowers her birth mother had loved. The porch light was on even in daylight, making the entrance warm and welcoming. Everything about the house seemed to whisper, "Welcome home." Inside, the house was filled with afternoon sunlight streaming through gauzy curtains. Amara's footsteps slowed as they entered the living room, her attention caught by the wall of frames. There, carefully arranged and lovingly displayed, were photos of her birth mother, smiling at her college graduation, laughing at a family barbecue, cradling baby Amara in the hospital. Latrice had kept them all, preserved them all these years. That's my favorite one, Latrice said, pointing to a photo of Amara's mother in a yellow sundress, dancing at a family reunion. She always loved to dance, just like you do. Amara reached out, her fingers hovering near the frame but not quite touching. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her face held a small smile. Later, as the afternoon stretched into evening, delicious smells filled the kitchen. Latrice stood at the stove, stirring a pot of her famous gumbo while humming, "This Little Light of Mine." Amara perched on a sturdy step stool beside her, carefully peeling carrots for the salad. The routine felt natural, as if they'd been doing this together forever. "You're getting good at that," Latrice praised, watching Amara handle the peeler with growing confidence. "Want to learn how to make the cornbread next?" Amara nodded eagerly. Her shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't been in years. The kitchen was warm and fragrant, filled with the sounds of cooking and quiet conversation. No tension, no walking on eggshells, no rigid rules about silence. After dinner, they settled into what was quickly becoming their favorite evening ritual. Amara sat cross-legged on a cushion between Latrice's knees, head tilted slightly forward, as gentle fingers worked through her hair. Latrice sectioned and braided with practiced ease, her movements unhurried and tender. "My mama taught me to braid when I was just a little older than you," Latrice shared, her voice soft and melodic. "Said it was important to know how to care for our crown of glory. Would you like to learn someday?" "Yes, please," Amara whispered, her eyes heavy with contentment. The new bedroom was everything Amara had dreamed of but never dared to ask for. The walls were painted a soothing shade of blue, like the sky just before dusk. Glow-in-the-dark stars dotted the ceiling in real constellation patterns. Latrice had researched them carefully. A nightlight cast gentle shapes on the walls, and the bed was piled with soft pillows in various shades of blue and purple. As Latrice finished the last braid, she noticed Amara's head growing heavier against her knee. The little girl's breathing had deepened, her body completely relaxed in sleep. With infinite care, Latrice gathered her close, cradling her against her chest as she had longed to do for so many years. She sat there for a long while, simply holding Amara, watching the peaceful rise and fall of her chest. This was what home should feel like: safe, warm, unconditional. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Amara stood in front of her mirror, admiring her neat rows of braids, each one tied with a purple ribbon to match her new backpack. She wore a yellow dress she had chosen herself, and her eyes sparkled with excitement about her first day at the new school. They walked hand in hand down the sidewalk, joining other families making their way to the elementary school 3 blocks away. Amara's steps were light, bouncing slightly with each stride. The morning air was cool and fresh, filled with the sounds of birds and children's voices growing louder as they approached the school gates. Near the entrance, a girl about Amara's age with puffy pink barrettes noticed them. She skipped over, her backpack bouncing. "Are you new?" she asked, smiling brightly. Amara looked up at Latrice, who gave her an encouraging nod. Then she turned back to the girl, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she spoke to a stranger without fear or hesitation. She let go of Latrice's hand, stood straight and tall, and said with quiet confidence, "I'm home now." Back at the house, the morning breeze still played with the swing, making it sway in lazy arcs that caught the sunlight. And there on the porch wall, pinned carefully where everyone could see it, hung Amara's latest drawing. In it, a little girl with bright eyes and braids stood strong and free, smiling wide, the broken pieces of a glass jar scattered harmlessly at her feet. If you enjoyed the story of Amara and Judge Reynolds, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.